This conference will now be recorded.
Can everybody hear me? Yes? Thumbs up? Okay, good. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining. My name is Crystal Schmick, for those of you who don't know me, and I am the president of the Rose Society of Tucson. And I want to thank you for coming to our October meeting. It's our second virtual one. Hopefully we do a little bit better than last time, but I still think it went pretty well. Just a quick reminder, if you're not talking, make sure you're muted. But if you do have questions for anybody, please use the chat option so we're not talking over everybody. And yeah, we're gonna have a nice presentation today. Diane, I know you said we were gonna do things a little backwards. Did you still want to do the presenter first and then?
Well, it looks like Les has joined us, so we could probably, if Les can turn on his microphone, then he,
All right, let's.
and he can give us, yes, we can hear you, but we can't see you.
No, well, that's probably good.
Well, Les. All right, Les.
My,
What do we do this month?
technical supervisor is trying to correct that. Just a second.
Oh, okay. So if you can, there you go. Now we can see you.
That's good. Okay.
So if you can go ahead and tell us what to do in the garden this month.
So they can see you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, back to the almost the same recording as we had last month with the weather. Luckily, our nights have cooled off considerably. We're still doing the hundreds during the day. And that lower temperatures at night really makes a huge difference. Probably cuts your water usage by anywhere from 20 to 40%. So that is, you know, it's not a matter of how much water you put on at a time, it's the frequency. I'm still watering my large pots every day. If we go down into the 90s, low to mid 90s, which they're guessing is going to happen next week, I'll probably go to every other day. And I've also, since you've pruned your roses, hopefully, you've got a lot less foliage to transpire moisture. So by going to every other day, you should be okay. On the potted roses, I would think that roses in the ground, if they're getting adequately watered, should be able to go 3 days between waterings. Just make sure you're giving them a real thorough soaking when you water them. None of this drip system on for 15 minutes a day. That doesn't do any good at all. Fertilizing is going to be on a pretty regular basis, every 10 days to 2 weeks. I'm using mostly Magnum Grow. I did throw some Epsom salts on my roses yesterday. Mostly, I should have done it 2 weeks ago, but I didn't realize I had a whole 50-pound bag until yesterday, so I threw some on there. I don't do any measuring. I just throw it on by the handfuls. You can't burn anything with Epsom salts, and it is immediately water soluble, so it does get into where it can work. And if I just finished up most of my pruning just in the last couple of days, I kind of put it off when we were still hitting 104s and 5s. Since we're not worried about having roses for a show, it doesn't much matter if we prune a little bit later. We still should have nice roses throughout the fall. It takes about 6 weeks for most of the varieties to recover from a pruning to have good blooms. So we're looking at blooms again in the second week in November and up through Thanksgiving and maybe beyond. You know, last year we didn't have any cold weather, real cold weather until after Christmas. Most people had roses clear up till Christmas or almost the first of the year. Excuse me. I don't do any spraying unless I don't do any preventative spraying. I know some people do. I have very few problems with both insects and diseases, so I tend to do minimal amount of spraying, if any at all. I have been using a product called Tempo, which is an artificial pyrethroid. Pyrethrins come from chrysanthemum plants. You can buy it online. It's called Tempo 2. And it is a it's a chemical, it's a derived chemical from, it's not a natural plant, but it simulates the natural plant product. It's very, very effective on contact spraying, has a fairly long residual. I've been using it for years. I spray all around the house with it. I spray around the doorways for crickets and silverfish and all the little creepy crawlers that come out. Very, very effective. It's if I remember right, it's around $35 for a pint, but you only use 8 milliliters per gallon, so it goes a long ways. It's listed as safe to use in food service situations, kitchens, pantries, public kitchens and pantries. So it's very, very safe to use. It's called Tempo, T-E-M-P-O. I think it's Tempo 2, and you can buy it online. I don't think anybody here locally carries it. I don't have much anything else to say. If I talked about before, if you're planning on ordering roses for planting in January, get online, find the roses you want, check with the growers and make sure that they will be able to ship you roses sometime between the middle of December and the middle of January. End of January is about the latest that we want to get bare root roses in. So it gives you a couple months to get your soil prepped. You can get rid of that rose that you really don't like and do your soil preparation and get ready for your new roses.
I only have one question, Les, which is from me, about if people are having problems with spider mites right now, and if you are, what should you do about it?
Spider mites can usually be at least controlled, maybe not eradicated, just by washing your roses off thoroughly. You can get a dram nozzle so you can get up underneath the foliage, but normally that's and you want to do it I do it every morning just because that's when I'm out watering. But make sure you wash your roses off thoroughly on the undersides of the rose petals and the leaves, and that will usually control it. I have seen no red spider this fall so far at all. So. I also don't have very many roses. I did lose some this summer. The ones I lost, most of them were between 35 and 40 years old. So I think they just decided that since everything else has gone south in 2020, they were going to get out too.
Okay.
Any other questions?
No questions?
I guess that's all the damage I can do. So.
All right. Well, thank you, Les. Diane, do you want to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker?
Okay. Tonight we have Bill Farmer joining us from the Albuquerque Rose Society. He's a master rosarian, and back in the late 2000s, people decided that they wanted to include photography in rose shows, and Bill, along with several other people, were instrumental in getting that started. And the Albuquerque Rose Society was one of the first to actually have the photography section in their show. So they kind of led the way on including that. And so I thought it would be good to have him on, and since we're doing virtual rose exhibits right now, and we'll have another one for our fall roses, I thought it'd be great to have him talk about some of the tips and how to have great rose photos. So he's gonna talk about that. Go.
All right. All right, Bill, I've made you a presenter, so thank you for coming.
You've made me the presenter already. Thank you.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was having trouble last week at a CR advisory committee meeting that my audio suddenly went out and I couldn't figure it out. So I'm glad it's working tonight. It makes it helpful. Otherwise, I just wave my arms a lot. Pretend you can tell what I'm trying to communicate. Thank you for inviting me here tonight. This particular type of presentation is kind of a first for me, so I have no idea how well it's going to go or how well it's going to be received, but we'll do our best. I have to say I've read the newsletter that Diane sent me, and I was impressed with the bio for me. Even though I didn't write it, I was still impressed with it. Let me make a disclaimer before I get too far into this. I know in the newsletter article it commented that I was going to provide some real advice on how to take great photos with a smartphone. I may be the most recent user of a smartphone. I finally disposed of my flip phone that had helped me for years and years and years, and I have a smartphone, and I can probably count the number of pictures I've taken with it on one hand. So I suspect there's many of you have much more experience than I do taking photographs with your phone. One suggestion I would make, if you want to have a presentation at one of your meetings by someone who knows phone photography inside and out and has been teaching it for several years, contact Sally Long out in San Diego. She gave a presentation for the Glendale group a few months ago, and it was absolutely outstanding. She knows what she's doing. Okay, I need to stop yapping and get on with what I'm supposed to be doing here. I guess I need to share my screen first, though, don't I? You'd think I'd never used this before. I'm a bad example of a trained meeting organizer. All right, Diane asked me if I would, provide a presentation with some tips and hints for how to make better photographs. And I'm glad she said how to make better photographs. Most professional photography instructors will use an expression right up front that they say, we take pictures, but we make photographs. There's a big difference between just taking pictures, what we used to refer to as snapshots, and making photographs that appeal genuinely to other people. So hopefully I'll be giving you some insight in just how to do that. I began taking pictures when I was 13, and I bought a camera for myself as a Christmas present. I began making photographs about 35 years ago when I got serious. I think I've probably learned more in the past 10 years than what I did in all the time that preceded that. So what I'm going to try to do is provide some insight and some examples in these areas. Some of them may seem on the surface to be very obvious, but maybe I can provide you some insight that gets it beyond the basically obvious thing. I suppose I should tell you my other disclaimer is that Diane in a conversation had told me that Your speakers are typically limited to about 30 minutes, and you could find a host of people in this district that tell you there's no way I could ever talk about anything in less than 30 minutes. I'll try, but I think I probably have too much stuff to cram it into 30 minutes. Anyway, the first thing that I would say is to get ready. Taking pictures basically is easy. You see, you snap, you move on to the next thing. You might post it on Facebook or share it in a text message to one of your grandkids or person next door, but they don't last long. A true photograph is something that you work on. You want this thing to be memorable to you and to other people. With any luck at all, being that we're all members of Rose Societies, you're looking to enter these photographs in competition. Well, there has to be something special about it before the judges are going to pin that blue ribbon on it. So I say be prepared. The first thing is when you're going to go outside and start taking photographs, take some time to assess the situation. What's the light situation today? How's the wind? Here, the wind is always blowing. I don't know about Tucson. I lived in Sierra Vista for 4 years and it wasn't nearly as bad as here. Are the subjects you'd want to photograph, are they available? Are they ready? Are they prepared? Check your equipment. Is your camera clean? Is it operating properly? Is the lens clean? Are your batteries charged? The last thing you want to do is be about, a third of the way into a nice photographic shoot, and you get the dead sign for your battery and your backup's not charged. If your SD card is full and you don't have a backup, you're done for the day, unless you want to take and just delete everything on there and start over. What accessories are you going to want? Filters for your lens, a cleaning kit. You'll see a 5-in-1 kit. If you don't know what that is, you will by the time I'm finished. Clips, I say extra hands. If you've got somebody that can hold things for you, that's great. If not, do you have something you can use to hold things and keep them handy for you? And set up your camera. At some point, if you haven't already, you will get to a point where you have your favorite shooting mode. Whatever that happens to be, you will have decided you prefer automatic focus versus manual focus. You set your white balance for whatever the conditions are at that time. Get this stuff done before you even head on outside. And it's going to save you some time, and you step out there ready to start looking at what you're going to photograph. I say select your subject. Now, I'm sure this comes across to most people as just a blinding flash of the obvious, but there's something behind it. It is interesting, in the 10 years or so that I've been judging photography within the district and some societies outside of our district, you'd be surprised at how many times we as judges stand there looking at a photograph trying to figure out what is it really supposed to be attracting my attention. Well, that's a photograph that isn't going to win. So choose your subject and ask yourself, and once you've chosen it, I'm going to assume that it has some interest to you and that's why you did. But ask yourself, will other viewers be interested in it? How likely is someone else to see it? Do I have odd taste? Or am I so far out on a limb that no one else is going to like this thing? Or is this just a little bit different than what people are used to seeing, and I'm attracted to it and so will other people be? And then if there's anything that you see or you sense you might be able to do to increase the subject's interest value to other people, this is a good time to think about how you're going to do that, whether you're going to be able to do it in camera or have to wait until you've got it on the computer and you're processing it. So let me give you a quick example. This is one of our favorite rose bushes, has been for many years, Austrian copper. And when it blooms, it's just stunning. But I wasn't interested in photographing the rose bush. I had an assignment in the class I was taking on flower photography, and I had a vision in mind for what I wanted to do. Unfortunately, because of where we parked the bush, getting in position to take the photo I wanted took quite a bit of effort. A lot of times getting into position is easier than getting back out of position. This was one of those days, but you can see I'm under a tree. I'm straddling my tripod. I'm trying not to step on any of the plantings that are under there. And I've got a look up kind of angle, which is what I really wanted. But if it would have been better if I had something to sit on, but it worked out. I got what I came for. I really wanted backlighting primarily, a little bit to the side, but I really wanted to capture the shadows of the stamens on the petals and see it from behind. And the instructor kind of liked it too. That was also helpful. There are 3 elements of photography that I believe are the 3 most important things in creating good photographs. Composition is one of those, exposure is one of them, and focus is the 3rd one. So in terms of composition, one of the things I like to do is to pre-visualize the frame. By the frame, I mean what's going to be captured by the camera. There's a few different ways to do it. One of the kind of the old ways was just to use your hands to kind of create a, if I can even do that anymore. Yeah, I used to know how to do that. See, use your hands like this to kind of create a little rectangular window to look through. I'll show you the cutout I use because it's a lot easier than trying to manipulate my hands anymore. Consider what I label here as accepted rules. I'm a believer that photography is an art, and art doesn't have rules, but in photography competition, there's rules. And the rules are basically what you can or cannot enter in specific classes. But if you've downloaded and read the ARS manual or handbook for judging rose photography, you'll see rules in there about what you can or cannot do with your photograph in terms of processing it. I understand what they're trying to do. I'm not in agreement with it. But anyway, there's various of these kind of rules I refer to as guidelines, and I'll show you examples of some of them. One of the things that really is important is managing the background. There are some photographs that I have judged and other judges. I see that Donaldine is online. She probably nodding her head. We see excellent capture of a bloom or a spray, but there's so much in the background that distracts us from seeing it, and it would distract any viewer. You know, it just doesn't score well. So there are things that we need to look for before we snap the shutter and do something about it. Distractions are the real bane of the photographer, and there's things that we can do to get rid of those things. So here's my little window. I just cut this out of a leftover piece of mat board when I used to mat and frame my own photos. The dimensions are different, obviously, than the sensor in my camera, but the ratio of the long side to short side are exactly the same as the sensor. So if I were to have my camera right here and take that picture, that's what would show up in my camera. Obviously, the closer you hold it to your face, the more you're going to see, and the less of the outside world you're going to see. When we walk outside, we see everything. It's just the way our eyes and brains work. The camera doesn't. The camera sees what you point it at. And so if you can put yourself in a position where you see basically what the camera is going to see, then you can tell, you get a pretty good idea whether that's going to be a good image or not. Now, I've used this for a long time. What I haven't tried yet, but I think it would work, I could use my phone, because it's got that same kind of shape, and I can hold that up and block out what's out around me if I focus on it. So you may want to try that. So one of those guidelines / rules is leading lines. And what leading lines mean is you've got something in your image that directs the viewer's vision from one part of the image or the frame off to another one. So in this case, which is I think is a really good example, you have 2 rows of roses that are moving from kind of lower left up toward the upper right, with a path, a walking path in between them. And in addition to that, you have this arbor that's moving in the same direction and gets up to the building. If I remember, haven't been there in a while, but I think that's where the tea room is. So leading lines are good. Especially they work well in gardens. They don't have to be straight lines. This photograph from the Mesa Rose Garden, the lines here are the paths again, and they lead you. Your view goes from what's near to what's far. Unfortunately, the far is not very attractive at all, but for an indicator, lines don't have to be straight. They can be curved, windy, or whatever. It's just something that captures the viewer's eye and moves it around in the image. Diagonals are one of the other rules or guidelines. I found that sometimes it's easier to find good diagonals in non-rose plants. This one in particular just was at a good time. I don't know when exactly this thing actually, the buds opened and bloomed, but that day was a pretty good photo opportunity. Again, this was another one I did for one of the classes I was taking a few years ago. One of the young photographers in our society that I've been mentoring for about 4 years now took this photo, and I don't know if the roses were actually growing in this nice diagonal line, or she put her camera off at an angle to capture it that way, but she did a really nice job. So it can be done with roses as well as other kinds of plants. So diagonals are good. You get the viewer's eye moving in a direction. The rule of thirds is probably one of the most, I won't say popular necessarily, but it's the most noticed. It's the one that I will say that the photography judges in the district tend to use when they look at a photograph first. The essence, the idea behind rule of thirds, which didn't come out of photography, it came out of the art world a couple centuries before photography was invented, is that the viewer's eye is more likely to view something if the center of attention is on one of these intersections, so one of these 4 intersections. In some types of photography, that works well. In the kind of photography we do with a single bloom, not so much. If you had this photograph sized so that the center of this bloom would be on this, I'll call it the southwest or southeast corner, parts of that bloom are going to be off the frame, and that's not going to score well in competition. So if you resize it so that the bloom is smaller and you can fit it in there and not lose anything off the edges, you've got probably twice as much empty space as you have bloom. That's not going to score well. So second best, instead of placing it on the corner or on the intersections, is place it on one of the 4 lines. That doesn't always work well because you get the same kind of perspective issue. So as a minimum, I would say, do what you can to try to get your center of attention off center. It'll be noticeable and it'll work. This is an old photo. I entered this the very first time I entered the ARS annual competition and got what then was called the Gold Award for it. I suspect if I entered this in a rose show today, might, on a good day, get a second place. These kind of photos now have garnered some negative commentary. They're referred to as bullseye photographs, catalog photographs. They're reminiscent of the kind of photographs you see in the Rose suppliers' catalogs. It comes across as rather flat and unimpressive. What we have to remember is that we're photographing a three-dimensional object, and we're trying to portray it as a three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional surface, whether it's a computer surface or if it's a piece of paper. And if it comes across flat, it's not satisfying the objective. So think about your perspective, the angle that you're photographing from. Do what you can to create on the image, on this two-dimensional surface, something that looks as though it's layered, that it has depth, and at least try to create that sense of a three-dimensional object, which the viewer knows it is. In the background, there always seems to be something in the background that you don't want. In this particular case, we've got this orange or yellow bloom off to the right, which turned out to be a bloom on another rose that was probably 6 or 8 feet away. So it was nicely out of focus, but it's still there and it's still a distraction. The glow in the upper center of the image is the glow from light reflecting off the lawn out past the rose bed. And it's a distraction because it's out there competing with the rose. There's not much you can do to control the light, but we'll see what we can do to outmaneuver it. So what I did in this case was take a small step to the right and drop down a bit. So taking that little step to the right, now I have to shoot a little bit more to my left and eliminate that other rose bloom out there. And by getting down and shooting at an upward angle, I've essentially elevated the rose above the glow, and now I got the glow as a backlight on the rose bloom. And so I was kind of satisfied with that. Here's another one with grass in the background. And I did nothing with this, no processing of any kind on it other than sizing it to meet the requirements of the rose show. What I liked about this when I was looking at it on my viewer, on my camera, was the fact that the foliage on the plant itself and the plant right behind it is, while it's out of focus, it's identifiable as foliage. But the further you went out into the lawn, the less noticeable individual pieces were. And so it just kind of creates this feeling of depth of going from something in focus to something out there that's not even close to being in focus. From time to time, you come across a situation where you have a bloom or a spray that has to be photographed. There's just no way you can leave it alone and walk back in the house and forget about it. This was one of those times. This is Cinco de Mayo, and it was in such a location that there was no way to photograph it without the background being an absolute distraction. So I cut it and I took it inside, put it in a vase, and propped up my homemade background. And it may sound like that's not fair, but I was not the first, and I'm still not the only person in the district who does that. It's fairly straightforward and easy to do on a day when, or a time when your foliage is really looking good. Go out there and take some photographs of the foliage, and then find someone that can enlarge it and print it And I'd say maybe, 20 by 20, 20 by 24, and have a few with different kinds of foliage, some large enough to pass for, a floribunda or hybrid tea background, and some with smaller foliage that'll pass for a miniature or something. People take things and photograph them in their studios. So basically what you're doing is creating a studio. I know Dave Mahoney has a studio on his patio behind his house, and it's one way to get out of the wind. I've got some other ideas on how to deal with breeze. I don't know how effective they are in the wind, but anyway, manufacturing a background is one way to kind of beat the odds. Distractions are they're everywhere. If you're into photographing outside, in nature, you're going to be confronted with distractions in the background. And this kind of light, natural light filtering through trees, foliage and stuff, is one of the most common and one of the most distracting. Now you could crop the stuff in the upper right-hand corner out. Your photo's not coming out of your camera as an 8x10, so you have to do something with it anyway to be able to enter it in a rose competition. But the distraction on the upper left side is too close to the roses. You can't crop that out. So, this is something where you have to change your perspective. You have to move. You have to get probably more to your left and shoot more toward the right, so that stuff's not in your frame. Here's another one that you see quite often, unfortunately. You've got another stem, a cane, or a branch of something that's growing up, and it's in the frame. And clearly the photographer either didn't notice, which I think is unlikely, or just didn't want to sacrifice that part of the bush. If there's any flex in it at all, I'd say, see what you can do about trying to bend it enough out of the way, then change your perspective so that you get it out of the frame. Either that, or you're kind of stuck. Find another bloom, or do what we just did, 2 frames ago. Snip it, take it inside or in some sheltered area and photograph it there. Some of the other kind of distractions, and like I said, it could be a long list. When you have a very bright background, you have a rose bush that's close to a wall and the sunlight's bouncing off of it, that's automatically a distraction, because most people's eyes move toward the brightest part of the image. You also have, in this case, you got some parts of what you can guess what they're part of. It's a frame of some sort, maybe an arbor or something like that, but without being able to see more of it and have the context, it just is a distraction. So my best advice in the situation here is that if there's anything at all in your image, in the frame of your image, that doesn't contribute to or enhance your subject, find a way to eliminate it. Don't let it be there and then you're stuck with it and you miss the opportunity to capture the image you really wanted to. So find a way to eliminate it before you even take the photograph. Okay, the second of our 3 biggies, exposure is basically the essence of the light. We know that without light, we don't have any photographs. It's that simple. It's necessary. We're trying to communicate visually with our photographs. If we don't have any light, there's no photograph, there's no communication. We have bright daylight, which is typically very harsh. We have diffused light, which we see in shade areas. Even on bright days, if you have an overcast, the light is diffused. Clouds do that to it. Fog is a great diffuser. It gives you other conditions you have to deal with, but there are natural things out there that diffuse the light and create a little softer lighting environment. Twilight is generally perceived to be that time about the hour before sunrise in the morning and the hour after sunset. That's a difficult time to photograph. Light is changing rapidly. If you've stood outside and watched a sunset, the time it takes for the sun to travel from where it is at noon to maybe 4 in the afternoon, I know it's a long time, but it just seems to take forever. But those final 30 minutes or so, when the sun is approaching the horizon, just seem to go by incredibly rapidly. If you want to photograph then, this is the time after. The golden hour is the hour just after sunrise and just before sunset. But in those times, the lighting is changing continually. And so it's a difficult time. You have to be prepared for it. And you have to be able to change settings on your camera very quickly. I want to make a point that if you're not familiar with the exposure triangle, it's an important tool. You really need to understand it, and I'll give you some insight into that soon. You need to have, or I suspect you would have at some point, your preferred exposure mode, the way you like to have your camera set to expose and take photographs. It's also worthwhile to get comfortable with a gadget called a histogram. I know from being in classes and giving presentations and being able to look at the expression on people's faces, they seem to be terrified of this thing called a histogram, and I really don't understand why, because it's a simple thing and it provides some really nice information. Bottom line with exposure, is that we really can't control light, but we need to teach ourselves and we need to learn how to manage light and use it to our own advantage. So let's get on with a couple of examples here. I suspect when you see this image, you think right away, bad light. I don't believe there's bad light. There's just light. Some of it's more attractive than others. Some of it's better for photography than other times. This was not a good time to be photographing. Whoever took this photograph was in a bad position at a bad time. Whether it would have worked better if they'd been on the other side or behind it, I don't know. Perhaps they could have gotten up an hour and a half earlier and it would have been better light. If they had any kind of material they could have used to diffuse or block the direct sunlight, that would have helped for sure. But it's still my best example of a photo opportunity gone bad. This one, on the other hand, was photographed in shade, where the light is even. There isn't that harsh beating down sunlight that reflects off the petals and the foliage. One of the things I've always noticed about photographing in the shade is colors seem to be more vibrant. In most cases, the colors are more vibrant in the photograph than they were on the rose itself. I don't mind that too much. Here's an example of backlight. Not direct backlight, it's a little bit off center, a little bit off toward the left. What I like about doing photos like this is that you begin to see just how translucent rose petals really are. When you can see parts of the background that are between the light and the rose, you can see their shadows, their images on the petals. I think that's kind of neat. The one thing about backlight, if the backlight was directly behind the image, so you with your camera, the rose or the subject, whatever it is, and the light were in line, chances are you would have lost the image that you were trying to photograph, unless you're trying to capture it as a silhouette. It's kind of the way cameras focus on and expose for the bright and whatever else is in there gets left in the dark. Another form that we have of light is side light. This tends to be one of my favorites, especially when I'm photographing singles, because I can capture the petals and the rose without any annoying bright lights on there. The stamens are usually up to the point where they're well focused and well lit, and I capture the shadows of the stamens on the petals. It's a good light. While there's no bad, there's plenty of good, and some gooder than others. Okay, here's the exposure triangle. If you're not familiar with this, I'll tell you what it is, and if you are already familiar with it, you may get bored in the next minute or two. Aperture, shutter speed, and a thing called ISO are the three factors that affect exposure. And that's it. Aperture determines the size of the opening in the lens when you take the picture. Shutter speed is a measure of how long that lens stays open when you take the picture. And the ISO is a measure of the sensitivity of the sensor in the camera, its sensitivity to light. In the old film days, it wasn't ISO, it was ASA. So if you grew up in the film days, and you still remember those days, you had ASA 100 color film, and if you wanted black and white, typically it was an ASA 400. Well, those numbers are still the same now, because what you had then was the sensitivity of the film, the emulsion on the film, and what it is now is the sensitivity of the sensor in the camera to light. So like I said, this one has a lot of information on it. If you're interested, let me know and I can get a copy to you. But just for an example, if I look at shutter or aperture over here with numbers that are measures of the size of the opening, and the smaller numbers are the big openings, and the high number like f22 is a tiny little opening. The wider the opening is, the shallower the depth of field. So portrait photographers like to use a low F number because they want to focus on the model's face, and they don't want anything in the background. They want the background to be blurred. So, that's not a bad place to start when you're photographing something like a single rose, which doesn't need very much depth of field. As you go further up with higher numbers, the window, the iris closes down to smaller and smaller, and you get a much greater depth of field. If you're doing landscape photography and you want everything in focus, that's where you want to be. When you have a wider opening, you're letting more light in. So your picture could be brighter. When you have a small hole, there's less light coming in. With shutter speed, the slower the shutter speed is, it means the longer that window is open, more light coming in gives you a brighter image. So these things all work together. It doesn't matter what kind of a camera you have, whether it's a very, very simple point and shoot that sticks in your pocket, whether it's your camera phone or if it's a $10,000 professional camera. These three things are there and they control the exposure. So it's important to understand the relationships between these three things. This upper left photo is my first digital SLR camera. It finally gave up the ghost. I guess I keep the photo of it just as a memory. But you can see there's various exposure modes on this dial. That one is set on manual, where you make all the decisions. The AV turns out to be my go-to mode. It's called aperture priority, and I get to set the aperture size that I want based on how much depth of field I want, how much of the image I want in focus. And I control the sensitivity with the ISO, and the camera selects the appropriate correct shutter speed to go with that combination. If you had a bit of a breezy day, I might go to shutter priority. I'll choose the shutter speed, and the camera will then choose the aperture. And if I don't like what the camera chooses, I can change the sensitivity, and that will have the camera change to match what I want. This was my first digital camera, a little point and shoot, and you can see how much choice you had there. You get to choose an icon, and somebody wrote a software equation, a mathematical equation in the computer in the camera. Decided if I chose portrait, it was going to set the camera to basically have a very, very narrow depth of field so that the face would be in focus and the background would be blurred. If I chose the mountain, it assumes I'm out there trying to take a picture of a river that winds its way through a valley and up the side of a mountain, and it wants everything in focus. But the control is with the camera. You as a photographer have no control at all other than which one of those icons you choose. I mentioned the histogram. This is kind of what it is. It's a depiction of the various luminance levels in your photograph. When you look at a photograph, you see there's some things that are darker than others. Some things are brighter than others. In this image, dark is on the left. Dark being absolute black is the 0. And on the right, absolute white is the highest, the number 255. There are 256 levels of brightness. So what you have is a measure of the number of pixels in each one of those little bins. Whoever wrote the math for that, is on a different planet than I am. This particular image leans a bit away from the center. So my hunch is that photograph is more on the dark side because there's very little over here in the middle and up in the light areas. If it was leaning the other way, I'd say the picture was bright. The one thing you really want to look for, I mean, there's no good or bad histogram. It's just what it is. It tells you what's at the pixel level in your photograph. If this graph were to bash up against the right edge and suddenly having a very abrupt stop, now that's a warning sign, because what that means is the brightest areas in your photograph have no information in them. There's no data of any kind. It's called clipping, and there's nothing you can do in post-processing to restore and retrieve that data. It's a sign that it's time to go back, adjust your camera settings, and try again. That's what's good about it. Now, here's one other thing that I've had this, geez, I don't know, 10 or 12 years probably. This is the infamous 5-in-1 reflector kit. There's there's 3 parts to it. The one on the left here, the bright one, is a wire ring with a translucent cover on it. This does a very good job of modifying direct sunlight, and I'm going to show you an example of that. The other 4 pieces are all part of the bag that the diffuser goes into. So the bag has 4 sides, 2 on the outside, 2 on the inside. And among those 4, there's a black one, a white, a silver, and a gold. The black one, if you put the hoop back in there and you hold that up, the black will block the sunlight from your subject. If you turn around, the white side will reflect sun. If you needed to kind of reflect some light back onto the subject to eliminate a shadow that's a distraction. The gold and silver are also reflectors that create not pure light, but a tinted light back onto your subject. And the top one is the bag that it folds up just like a windshield shade does and slips away in this pocket up there, the bag. This is one of the smallest ones on the market. It's about 20 or 22 inches in diameter. So it's fairly easy to deal with. It just doesn't, unless you can really hold it up high, it doesn't block a lot of the sun. But for photographing a single bloom, it does a really nice job. They come in sizes all the way up to, I think, about 60 inches. That's when you need a helper along with you to do the holding while you manage your camera. This one in today's prices, probably around close to $20. The bigger ones are probably upwards about 70 or 80 bucks. So here's a photograph I took deliberately out in the sun with no shade of any kind, no diffuser. What you're seeing in that upper right-hand corner is the histogram, and over to the right side, there's a spike of red. That's an indication that there are highlights that are just blown out and there's no information. So then it also paints those areas red so you can see right away where you have this really bright light. And if you put this up on your computer screen, after you get done here, it's probably going to show up pretty close to being white instead of the yellow that honey perfume should be. So I took a second shot just a moment later, holding up my diffuser screen. And it made quite a difference. Now, it doesn't help put the sky in the background, but that's not what I was trying to get with this little example. So now our third part is focus. This is another one that might seem like a blinding flash of the obvious. Well, of course you want your photograph in focus. There are times when trying to photograph a rose and get the part you really want in focus isn't as easy as you would like it to be. One of the things I want to, sort of reinvigorate is the idea of how to hold a camera. Most of us, if we started photographing before the digital age, we're taught how to hold a camera. And most of us will still remember that and try to do it that way. But we certainly don't do that with cameras, with our phones. One of the things we need to do is decide, this goes along with that, choosing the subject, decide what's the most important thing in that image and be sure we focus on that and that we have the sharpest focus that's obtainable. If we're hand holding a camera, it's still important, even though we now have built-in image stabilization systems, some depending on the camera maker. It may be in the camera or it may be in the lenses. We still need to know, hand holding the camera, what is that minimum shutter speed that we can safely have and have no camera shake at all. If you're not familiar with back button focus, maybe it's not available on your camera. If you have it, it's worth giving it a try. I started using that a couple of years ago, and I haven't even thought about looking back. Again, in photographing, I rarely go out to photograph without my tripod and my remote trigger release, my shutter release. And I could give you a lot of hints about why. And then in some of the newer cameras, it's newer generally translates to more expensive, I know. There's a feature you could use for focusing that I found to be very valuable. This is briefly, what most of us learned about holding the camera. Basically find a way to stabilize it, whether it's pinning your elbows into your sides, but you want to try to remove any possibility that there's any movement when you take this picture, okay? So those kind of things, still rule. If you're not in a position where you have a tripod available or it's not convenient to have it, you're out wandering around through a public rose garden or a botanic garden or something like that, where they won't even, our botanic garden won't even let you in with a tripod if you don't have you're pre-registered or something like that, as though you're a professional photographer. So find a way. If you can't, hand hold it like this guy's doing it. See if you can lean against a wall, a lamppost or something like that, but find a way to get stabilized. Makes a big difference. Especially if you're into close-up and macro photography. This is where I tend to spend my time. And this was another one I did in a class. This was quite a few years ago. But I am fascinated with the innards of flowers of all types and shadows that they cast on their petals. One of the things that, if you haven't noticed it, you might, this is Golden Wings, and it's in automatic focus, depending on the mechanism that the camera uses for focusing, which in most cameras is looking for contrast. If there's not sufficient contrast for the camera to effectively automatically focus, it comes out a little blurry. But this creates an opportunity to use a feature that is in my newer camera in live view, where I see the image on my screen rather than through the viewfinder, well, in addition to the viewfinder. But within live view and manual focus, there's a zoom feature, and I can zoom the image, and it doesn't change what the camera photographs. So I could zoom in on the center of this this image and fine tune the focus, take the picture, and it's not the picture of the thing zoomed in, it's this that comes out of it. That's pretty handy, because especially in photographing where you're really trying to emphasize stamens, for example, with singles or anything that's in the fully open class. In those two classes, categories, if the stamens aren't in focus, the judges aren't likely to give that photograph a blue ribbon. When it says stamens must show, it means stamens must show and be in sharp focus. So that's worth keeping in mind and find the best way to do it. This is a gadget that showed up on the market some years ago called a PLAMP. I guess that's a acronym for plant clamp. This particular thing has been around now for quite some time. It's mostly plastic. It's difficult, or can be difficult to use. And it costs about between $45 and $50. This is my version. 2 pieces of copper wire with a rubber coating. Some cable ties I happen to have plenty of in my garage, and a package of 4 clamps. Total expense, not even 10 bucks, and I still have 2 clamps available to make 2 more. This is a very thin stem, so I used 2 of them on this, one to kind of pull the main part of the stem over, because it's really leaning off to the right, try to pull it up, and then the one on top to kind of stabilize it. And you can see that I got a clamp on one end, and I just take the other end and wrap it around the tripod. You could wrap it around a stake in the ground or a good solid cane somewhere. But if there's any kind of airflow, any kind of air movement, you want to stabilize this thing, unless you go to the shutter priority mode and use a really fast shutter speed. But you're sacrificing in other areas when you do that. So this is a handy thing to have. And if I needed more length, I could just take and wrap the 2 ends that don't have clamps, wrap those together, and I've got this extended out probably close to 6 feet. Just little tools. Editing and processing. There's a lot of times when these two terms get used interchangeably. I think they're different. I think editing is when you go in on the computer and you fix something that just didn't come out right. You thought you had your white balance set for daylight, and you find out you've got a tint in your image, and you need to correct that. Or you lost some detail in the shadows and you're trying to get that back out. But there's a spot on a petal and you want to try to remove that. Processing is the more creative side of the situation. you're cropping, you're dodging and burning, you're doing things to create your vision. And so both of them are fine. Here's an image I took during a class almost 10 years ago. This bloom was about 10 to 12 inches off the ground between the rose bush and the deck outside the back door. I got down in there, and this is one of those situations where it was easier to get in there than it was to get out. I felt trapped, but after all that effort, I wasn't impressed with the photo at all. There's too many blemishes on the rose itself. There's not enough evenness in the petals, and so I just kind of set this thing aside. I could have edited on here and corrected, eliminated some of the blemishes and taken it and tried to use it anyway, but I chose not to. A couple of years later, I decided to do some processing. I had a different vision. And it's amazing what you can eliminate just with simple cropping. So it changed the look of this particular rose quite dramatically, but it also changed the class that I could enter it in. The previous photo could have gone in, as a single bloom. This one has to go in creative interpretation. A year or so later, I tinkered again. I got a totally different look. And depending on how your photo schedule or the schedule in the show is laid out, this either is still in creative interpretation with everything else, or there may be a separate black and white class. There's a few of us in the district we grew up with black and white. We're still fans of black and white. And I still like to tinker with black and white. And so I try to keep a black and white class in our show schedule here. Printing is another thing that is important. If you're doing a virtual show, it doesn't matter. If you're posting things online, it doesn't matter. But if you're entering in competition, it does matter. And your choices are basically to send your images off electronically to a commercial printer, or you do it yourself at home. If you're using a commercial printer, my best advice is practice ahead of time. Do some experimenting. I know if you send off to a professional laboratory, there are people there that have photography backgrounds, they know printing, and if things don't come out looking right, they'll be in touch with you to find out what you want to do about it. If you send it off to the neighborhood drugstore, chances are the only time it touches human hands is when it comes off the printer and they put it in a bag with your name on it. My experience there is you can't even be sure that an 8x10 print will actually all show up on the paper. I've seen them shifted to a point where you'd lose maybe a half an inch or so off of one end. So if you're printing at home, you probably have a little more control, but it's important that your monitor is calibrated properly. It'll get out of whack just by using it over time. And so before you settle down to print for a print competition, you want to be sure you calibrate the monitor. It's important, I think, to match or to be sure that your printer, the ink, and the paper you use are compatible. That may sound simple, but it really isn't. There's a lot of off-brand, inks that are available on the market, and we're tempted to go to them because they seem to be less expensive. It's cheap stuff, and it's not compatible basically with, I know it's not compatible with Canon or Epson printers. And paper is the same kind of thing. The best way to ensure that those three things are compatible is to keep them in the same brand. I use an Epson printer with Epson ink and Epson papers. Now, Dave Mahoney put me onto a company called Red River. I've got some of their paper, and they have dedicated profiles, which is software for the computer that matches the paper to the computer. And it works out pretty good. But again, if you haven't done a lot of this, you experiment ahead of time. Be sure that what's on your screen, you want what's on the screen that you've been satisfied with, that's what shows up on the paper. And you don't want to take that chance the day before show. So I think I'm down at the end and I can hear all the cheering.
Oh, if you could wrap it up a little bit, you have a couple of questions.
Questions? Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, photography has been one of the things that I've enjoyed since I started. It's rewarding, but there's some aspects of it that are much more challenging than other aspects, and it just takes a lot of experience, practice, and time, you know, to get comfortable with these things. So practice is the big thing to do. Just stick with it. Take your roses, get them, or your photographs, get them printed, and enter the competitions. You're never really going to know how well you could do if you're standing on the sidelines and watching. So take those things to the shows, get them entered, and volunteer to clerk. Volunteer to clerk and listen to what the judges are saying. Listen to them debate with each other about what they think is good or not so good or great. And if you have questions, I mean, you know, when you're getting your briefing as a clerk, you're supposed to not interfere with the judges. Don't get in their way and don't ask them any questions. So track them down afterwards. Most of them are getting a free lunch after the show. That's a good time to pester them. Ask your questions. Don't let them put you off. They're supposed to be not just judging, but helping. So keep practicing. Go online and, you know, search for professionals who have blogs, who have websites, who are offering courses, and particularly some that specialize in photographing flowers. One of my favorites is a lady in Maine. His name is Kathleen Clemens. I've followed her work. She makes spectacular flower photographs, and I took a class from her. Helped a lot. And that's one of my next suggestions. Take a class, find something at the local community college, online. I mean, there's a lot of them offered now, so do it. But remember that as far as I'm concerned, photography is an art. If you have a vision of what you would like to produce and show to people, pursue it. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Let's see, Nancy. Nancy, you had a question about what lights?
It's
Yeah.
like one of the first roses taken from the side. It almost looked like artificial light, and I wondered how that was done.
Which one?
It was kind of a yellow rose, and it was the first rose taken from the side. It's really early in the slides. I don't know, I asked the question at the time. I don't know how to.
From the side?
Yeah. And the
Yes.
light was just on part of the rose. It was just real dramatic, the lighting, and it didn't
This
look
one?
like natural light. I think it was soon after this one. It was a little later. That's underneath. This was from this. I think it was it went away. You can't see my indicator. Wait, keep going back older. It was yellow one. Oh, well, it doesn't. It was way
I
up.
think it was Playboy.
This one?
A little more.
You did.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, that might, no, it was
This-
more from the side, I think.
Yeah, this one was just on a cloudy day.
Uh,
I'd entered a photograph of oranges and lemons a couple of years ago that had this same kind of nice, vibrant color. Dave Mahoney said, "What did you do to the photograph to get that deep orange?" And I said, "I just photographed it. It was sitting down inside the plant, and it was a cloudy day." And he said his is always just, you can barely see the orange. I said, well, you live in a hotter world there too.
Thank you.
You mean, well, this one,
It did look artificial. That
that's
must
not,
have been it. No,
there aren't any before
was
this.
one.
Hmm?
I think that's the one.
This one here?
No, the one you told us, a
No.
cloudy day.
Oh, this one?
No, the one you just were talking about.
Oh, this? Oh, I see, on Playboy.
Yeah,
That one.
thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
There's another question from Lou about, have you used any gimmicks in photography like water mist on blooms or dry ice smoke or anything like that?
No, and the interesting thing about, water drops, almost every book I've read on flower photography, and I have several, and I've taken 4 classes on different types of, all the instructors recommend going out there with a little spritz bottle in the morning and spritzing the rose. Well, guess what? I mean, the rose judges in the American Rose Society don't like water drops on rose petals. I don't know what it is that's got them all turned off, but in that judge's handbook, there's even reference to it, to avoid doing it. I'm thinking, good grief. So there's something different between the amateur ARS world and the professional photography world. There's a lot of differences, but that's one of them.
Uh-huh.
I would say, if you're going to do it, be very careful about it, almost to the point of manually, physically placing drops on specific locations rather than just spraying the rose. The other thing I would say is do that in a way that you can get some reflections in those drops so that it's more than just a drop of water sitting on a petal. There's something there in the drop that attracts attention.
This one's from Army Mulholland. She wanted to know if you use a DSLR camera.
I do. I have a Pentax K3 Model 2. I bought it after they released a newer version so that the price dropped dramatically. I don't have to have the brand newest thing. I don't have to be standing in line overnight to get the newest thing. I'll take upgrades from time to time, but this one suits me just fine. It's not a full frame camera. That would have probably, and Pentax has one, but that probably would have cost me about $1,500 more than what I paid for my camera. And it's just bigger, it's bulkier, it's heavier. It has a larger sensor. It can produce not better photos. It's not the camera that determines how good your photos are. It's the person holding the camera. There are things I've tried with my phone that I know I can't do. One is that discussion I had about using live view and manual focus. The fact that I can zoom in on the rose, I could zoom in and focus on the stamens and take the picture. And what I get is what I saw before I zoomed. Now I can zoom in on my phone and the picture I get is the zoomed in picture. I don't get, what I had originally framed. So That's one thing I don't get. One of the things I've been experimenting with over the last couple of years, and just I haven't done it well enough to show to anybody, is shooting through something at something. So if I have a rose, I first tried this some years ago on a climber, and we had some kind of a plant about 10 feet away from it, and I was behind the plant trying to shoot through it, and so that part would be so close it would just be blurry to the point when you couldn't see any definition. And so it'd be kind of a blurry haze in front of this image. I just haven't got it to work out. Keep playing though.
Okay.
But it can't do that on a phone either. It wants to put everything in focus.
We have a couple more questions. Do you tend to underexpose photos by half stop or so to get more brilliant colors?
I tend to overexpose by a half to one stop. And part of the reason is it doesn't matter too much if you have a very low ISO, like 100 or 200. But if you're in a situation where you have to get up to 1600 or so ISO, you start to introduce noise into the image. And if you underexpose and then you have to brighten it when you're in processing, you've just enhanced all that noise. It becomes more noticeable than it was before. And so that's part of the reason I tend to overexpose a little bit, because if I have to darken the image a little bit before I print,
Okay. Thank you very much for all the great information. There's several thank yous on here. And Debbie said before you quit, close the other windows so we could see the photo of the children and the leads.
okay. Let
right.
me shut this part down. I'm gonna get rid of that part. And I can get rid of this part. And I can get rid of that part. Those are our grands.
Ah,
Okay, it hadn't. There's a time lag, obviously.
yeah.
There we go.
Oh, wow. That's a great photo.
3 and 8 and 9,
Ah,
right to left. Their mother's a professional photographer,
oh, wow.
portrait photographer.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
Crystal.
Grandson married well.
Yeah. All right, Crystal, you can take over.
All right, thank you, folks. Enjoyed it.
Thank
Nobody
you.
keep you up too late.
Thank
But
you.
if one, you know, you can,
Thank you.
can
Your
be happy
grandkids
about it.
are adorable.
It's later here.
Okay. All right. Does anybody else have any general questions? I've got a note from Les saying he's getting ready to order 24-inch pots. If you want any, to let him know. His phone number is 520-624-0931. So he's got some nice pots, big pots for standards. So give him a call if you would like some of that. Anybody else have?
How soon is he planning to order?
Les?
Let's turn
Oh, turn on your microphone.
Okay. Am I
Just turned him up.
back on?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I can.
Yes.
They're the 24-inch TerraPots. I haven't ordered any for over a year. The last time I ordered them, I think they were about $32, including shipping and taxes. And I will probably be ordering by the end of the week because the sales rep is going to actually bring them over from California for me.
Okay. Yeah, I'll probably give you a call when we figure out how many we really want, because we can't find them here in Albuquerque at all.
Oh,
And
okay.
we have plants that have, it's time to move them up to bigger pots.
Yeah, I'll I'll ask my rep if he can find out if anybody in Albuquerque sells them or can ship them. They can be shipped. I can
Okay.
tell you the price will be higher though.
Yeah. Well, you know, if they hadn't shut down all the shows in Arizona and everywhere else, you know, they usually make about 3 trips a year over there. So
Right.
not this year.
Yeah.
Not this year. And maybe not the spring shows either. I don't know. Hard to tell.
Okay.
Yeah, if somebody here actually handles them or they can, you know, ship my part here, it would be a little bit easier. I didn't want you to be burdened having them in your garage for a while.
Well, I got a place.
When Lou first told me that you had a deal going, that was early this year, and I thought, yeah, well, you know, I'm going to be back in a few weeks. Few is a big number.
Yeah.
All right. Does anybody else have any other questions or anything they want to announce? If not, I'm going to go tuck my kid into bed. So,
Okay, thank
all
you.
right.
Bill. Thanks, Bill. You were
All right.
terrific.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it. I'm looking for your photos in the show too.
Yeah.
All right.